Hello, historians. Today we are going to grapple with a really big question, and that is, how did we get here? This is the project of historians constantly, to analyze who we are and how we came to be. And in the case of the modern kind of contemporary 21st century, there are a lot of problems and issues facing America that historians can help sort of unravel if we look at the conditions of humanity and some of the ways that our civilization has organized itself around these issues, these foundations, or these conflicts. So today's lecture really addresses this question of how did we get here with regard to one particular concept, and that's partisanship. So we're going to talk about partisanship today. It doesn't matter to me if you fall on like the Democrat or the Republican side, or if you're conservative or liberal, but I do hope that today's lecture gives you a little bit of pause about your own kind of assumptions and your own biases about your political stance and the political stances of others. We will have some interactive elements to the lecture, so I will at one point pause and let you know what materials you need to assemble. And throughout the lecture, I encourage you to go ahead and pause if you need to pause the recording to complete the work that is requested of you. But without further ado, let's get started. So how did we get here? Today's discussion is on partisanship and moral foundations theory. These two things may seem relatively interconnected, or they may seem very disparate depending on kind of your viewpoint. So first we're going to define and explore partisanship just lightly, and then we're going to go really deep into this concept of moral foundations theory. So you'll have a chance to really interpret what moral foundations theory means and see it in relationship to this concept of partisanship. As always, I'm your hostess, Dr. Summer Sherland, and I am glad you're here with me today. So partisanship, it's a new thing, right? It just happened starting in the 1990s. Not true, actually. In fact, the founding president of the United States of America, George Washington, warned against partisanship in his farewell address in 1796. This is only a decade or so after America was founded. And Washington, the first president of the country, is about to close down the first presidential term, and he gives his farewell address. In it, Washington explains that this brand new baby country, America, is going to be met with two major threats. And he predicts that one of these threats, if not both, is going to provide the downfall of this country. The first is entanglements with other countries. He says, stay neutral, America, stay out of global or alliance-based conflicts with Europe or other monarchies. The second thing he warns against is partisanship. Washington was very concerned about the division of the country that he was beginning to see, the fracturing between two political parties as they sought to make up Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, as well as the executive branch and the judicial branch. So he said, let's beware of these camps or these parties that are forming, and don't allow these political parties to deeply influence the well-being of the country from the beginning. Now, he could have been talking about Democrats and Republicans in the 21st century, but he wasn't, right? He was talking about the political partisanship of his own time, but it really did define the 1790s in some ways, and it came to define American history from that point forward. Well, nobody really heeded his concern. I mean, not nobody, but lots of people didn't heed his concern. And in fact, the second guy who takes on the presidency, John Adams, actually initiated many partisan-based laws from the moment he got to office. So it didn't even take one more presidential term before you begin to see the disregard of Washington's concerns. So what is partisanship? What do I mean when I use that term? If you were to Google it, you might be able to find a good definition. And here's one that I'll use. It's the prejudgment, right? The prejudicial belief. And prejudgment means you're judging something, you're analyzing something, you're making assumptions or judgments based on before you've actually interacted with that issue or that person. So it's before. And these beliefs are typically based on your own prioritized issues or your biases. Any sort of extreme loyalty you might have to one issue or another, or to one political party over another. So think of yourself, think of your parents, think of aunts and uncles or teachers who you know of that may only vote for one party's representative or one party's backed initiative based on the little R or the little D next to that person's name or that ballot measure's name. But they're more interested in aligning with the party or with the affiliation instead of looking at the nuances of the issue or the person. So that's a great definition of partisanship. And partisanship is not just motivated by like random kind of buy-in to a team or a group or a collaboration. It's motivated by this idea of attribution asymmetry. So if you think about symmetry, it's mirror imaging, right? So if you were to stand in front of a mirror, that's symmetrical. Your face is symmetrical to the mirror version, or unless, barring some incident or accident or something, if you put your hands together, typically they, often look like symmetrical versions of themselves, right? This is the belief, though, when it comes to asymmetry, it's the slipping, right? It's the distinction between this is not symmetrical anymore. So we no longer are each other's counterparts. And attribution asymmetry, motivation attribution asymmetry is the belief that I am motivated by good things, right? I'm motivated by love. I'm motivated by fairness. I'm motivated by loyalty or sort of hierarchy and belief in order. But everybody who doesn't agree with me is motivated by bad stuff, hatred, bias, stereotyping, right? Evil. This is a belief that is fracturing society, and this is what's contributing to like extreme division among parties, because we all live in our own psyches, right? You live in your own brain, you live in your own body. You're constantly negotiating with yourself what you believe about certain things. Therefore, the more you think it over, the more you're able to align your beliefs with what you think is good and what you think is right and what you think is fair, right? But you don't live in anybody else's body and you don't live in anybody else's brain. So you become kind of conditioned to believing that it's your values that are good, and anyone else who doesn't share those values is either simply wrong, or they're evil or misinformed or lazy or hateful, right? Because you don't know the same process they've had for years while they're analyzing these same issues. So partisanship is the extreme loyalty to one party, one group over the other. And motivation attribution asymmetry is the belief that your values are good and other values are bad. And it's perfectly natural if you're doing either of these things, right? And we're going to find later today with our moral foundations theory exploration that it doesn't make you a bad person for falling victim to some of these forces. It's just good to recognize it and question it, so that you can hopefully help sort of save the country in some ways, but also just sort of save your own relationships. So am I part of this problem, right? Like you're probably thinking, oh, all those people who are feeling this way and viewing people this way are just, they're such a problem, right? Well, maybe you're part of the problem too. Maybe we all are. So I'm going to ask you two questions. Do you believe more yes or more no, right? Do you believe more yes or more no that those who vote or would vote opposite of you on some issues are bad, immoral, or hateful? So pick an issue, whatever your most significant issue is, the thing you think is facing your generation more than anybody's today in America. Maybe it's climate change or wealth distribution or LGBTQ rights. Maybe it's women's rights. Maybe it's gun control and gun freedom or gun access, right? Whatever issue you're on, whatever you think is the most significant, do you believe that those who would vote opposite of your choice are somehow bad or hateful or immoral? How about this next question? Do you believe that people affiliated with a certain party or political belief are straight across the board un-American, not patriotic, or a threat to our country? Just look at those two questions. Be really honest with yourself. Do you believe one of these things, more yes or more no? Here's something that was done in 2016. So these numbers have actually changed quite a bit, but we'll look at 2016 because it was a volatile year in American politics. This was the year of the campaigns between, or the election campaigns for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So how many Americans polled had, quote, very unfavorable opinions about voters from another party? Do you think it was kind of on the low side, 12 to 17%, or 27 to 32? Do you think it was right in sort of the middle of the road, 55 to 58%? Or do you think it was on the higher end, 79 to 84%, or 91 to 96%? And there's a 5% margin for each of these numbers. So how many Americans have a very unfavorable opinion about voters of another party? So think to yourself, raise your hand rhetorically, right? Do you think it's 12 to 17% have an unfavorable opinion about voters from another party? 27 to 32, 55 to 58, 79 to 84, or 91 to 96? So the answer is that middle of the road. When they were polled in 2016, Americans indicated that regardless of party, this is an equal poll that was taken between Democrats and Republicans. Each group had about 55 to 58% of their group said that the other party was unfavorable, very unfavorable opinions of the other party, and that's across the board. Now, these numbers have changed a bit since 2016, but they've increased, making America even more hostile towards each other. In 2019, the researcher Arthur Brooks said that millions of us, not a few, not a loud minority, right? Millions of Americans are patently wrong about the views of those who disagree with them politically. So the assumptions we have of people who disagree with us politically are wrong. We are wrong about what we think they think, essentially. And worse, Americans have developed hatred and contempt for the other side, but it's based on our own bigotry, our own ignorance, right? So not only are we wrong about what other people believe, we're being biased and we're being bigoted because of those inaccuracies. Here's an example that Brooks explains. Today, in 2019, when he did his study, more than 90%, this is a very, very high number, of both Republicans and Democrats believe people in their party to be honest, reasonable, and caring. Okay, all good, right? So you're in the Democratic Party, you're in the Republican Party, whichever side, and 90% of those of us polled think that people in our party are good, right? Honest, hardworking, reasonable, empathetic, caring, all those things. Meanwhile, almost that exact same number, 80% of people polled in both parties believe the other side to be brainwashed and hateful. Okay, so you can see why that number, that 55 to 58% who view each other unfavorably, is skewing even more radically to the right or to the left based on your political viewpoint. So again, you're not wrong if you believe this. I mean, you're inaccurate, but according to Brooks, and you're not bad if you believe these things. Something is happening that is causing us to view each other in such hateful and frustrating ways. So back to today's question. How did we get here? How did this happen? We have got to explore this as a class, don't you think? Don't we owe it to ourselves to explore this a little bit? Okay, you're going to need some materials for the remainder of this lecture. We are going to explore the moral foundations theory, and we're going to put it in a mind map in relationship with partisanship. So you're going to need some materials. You're going to need a blank piece of paper. You can use paper like I'm going to, because I like things to be sort of tactile and in the moment, or you can open a Word document on your computer. It's up to you. You're going to need colored ink. I use black, red, blue, and probably green today, but you can use any combination of colors that works for you. And you need the ability to share or show your work today. So either a camera, or if we're doing this live, you'll need to, have a way to share your materials with each other. All right, pause the recording if you'd like and go assemble your materials. When you're ready, come on back and we'll get started. Welcome back. Start with a blank piece of paper. Next, you're going to fold your paper into 3 parts. So I did it hot dog style, right? I think that's hot dog style. I can't remember. And then you fold it in 3 parts with a middle column and 2 sides, one on the left, one on the right. All right. Again, I'm going to go through this activity and encourage you to pause as you need to follow along. We're going to create a mind map. Start in the middle column and write the following words: moral foundations theory. What is moral foundations theory? Here's a quote from the book that coined this phrase. In brief, the theory proposes that several innate, meaning kind of already in your psychological and emotional well-being, and universally available psychological systems are the foundations of intuitive ethics. So we intuitively, as human beings, and in some cases mammals, share a common code of ethics, right? And each culture then, so humans share ethics, but cultures organize those ethics in different ways. And this, therefore, we construct virtues or systems or institutions or narratives, even the things we tell ourselves about ourselves, on top of these foundations. And therefore, we create sort of unique systems at play that then ultimately conflict with each other. So I want you to paraphrase that sentence. Take a look at it, pause the recording, and try to write in your own words what you think moral foundations theory means based on that quote I just read to you. All right, I wrote mine, and you'll probably see a version of this in a moment, but I wrote all civilizations and societies share basic principles. Basic principles. So whatever you wrote, hopefully it's something like that, something kind of correlating with mine, that all civilizations and human societies share these basic principles. So let's explore each of those principles. In your middle column, below where you paraphrased, I want you to draw 5 rectangles or squares. Try to make them about the same size. And again, you can pause your recording and pick up when you're ready. Okay, did you get your 5 squares drawn? These are mine. So as close as you can get them to looking about the same. All right, you're going to put these words in each of your 5 squares. So you'll have a square for each, and you see them represented here on the screen. And again, every society organizes itself around these 5 basic foundations. So I wrote all civilizations and societies share basic principles, but you could also write something like every society organizes itself around these 5 basic foundations. So that's kind of our definition. And each of these squares will have one of these 5 things written in them. So at the top of the square, but leaving a little bit of room to write your own notes, I want you to write each of these things. So in one square, you write care versus harm. In the next square, let's see how I wrote that. Fairness versus cheating. Okay. In the next square, loyalty versus betrayal. Square number 4, authority versus subversion. And finally, sanctity versus degradation. So you can see I left some space in each box because I'm going to walk you through each of these foundations. All of these 5 foundations, which are shared among human societies, we're going to go one by one. I'm going to read you like a quote from the book, and also give you some examples, and then give you some time to fill in the boxes with buzzwords or examples that seem to really stick out to you to help you understand these concepts. Box number 1, care versus harm. All human societies share this basic principle. And in fact, there's evidence that all mammals share this basic foundational principle. This is because we are linked, right, to mammals in terms of the way human beings conduct the way they live in their societies, in their family units and in their larger group cultures. That's because all mammals have versions of attachment, right? All mammals have ways of kind of feeling and caring for the young, and in some cases, feeling and caring for elderly. We have an ability as humans to have empathy. There's a psychological aspect to empathy. You may not, like, you may see somebody who gets injured really badly, and you may not actually physically feel the way they feel, but you have an empathetic structure that allows you to feel so much sympathy for them that you actually embody or take on part of their pain. This is one of the things that underlines humans' kindness towards each other, right? Gentleness, the way we treat each other well, and with nurturing, we nurture each other. So all civilizations have ways of functioning in ways, we have ways of functioning in a regard that helps serve elderly or protect the young, right? And people who need additional assistance. And with that, that's the care side, right? Then you have the harm side. All civilizations, all societies have ways to react to threats. And individually, you are built, psychologically speaking, to react to threats. That's part of your genetic and physiological makeup, right? So you have a way of responding to threats at all levels. Extreme threats like violence, right? And threats to your safety and security, and also smaller threats like gossip. How do you respond when you find out someone's been gossiping about you or about your sister or your friend, something like that? So pause the recording and fill in that care versus harm box with any buzzwords or examples or things that kind of help you understand this particular moral foundations theory. If everybody in the world shares this moral foundation, what are the shared virtues of care versus harm? Here's what I wrote. Care, under care, I put protection and empathy, as well as care for young and elderly. Under harm, I put threats and violence. Those are just going to help me remember what care versus harm means when it comes to moral foundations theory. Box number 2, fairness versus cheating. All human societies have ways of dealing with fairness and cheating. And this foundation is related to an evolutionary process, right? Something that happened over time as human beings continually organized themselves into tribes or organizations or civilizations. It generates for us, when you think about the ideas of fairness and cheating, the ideas of justice, right? Accountability. When you break a rule of the society, is that, how do you see that being enforced or reprimanded? Our rights as individuals within the society. What's my right in this group? What are my responsibilities in this group? And also concepts of autonomy. How do I govern myself versus how do I expect others to govern themselves? There's a lot of discussion in terms of fairness and cheating when it comes to equality or proportionality. So equality and equity are not the same, right? And to treat everyone fairly is not the same thing as treating everyone equally. So the idea of equal is that it's an equilibrium. We're all like kind of on the exact same plane. But the idea of fairness or equity is that you sort of weigh the balance based on who needs more, right? And that's proportionality. So some people see fairness as proportionality. Other people see fairness as equality across the board. This is also where you get sort of the beginnings of rumblings about cooperation and competition. So how we contribute to the group versus how we compete as a group with other groups. So again, pause the recording and write down some buzzwords that help you understand human civilization organizations around fairness and cheating. All right, I wrote quality and equity, or equality and equity, accountability, autonomy, and rules and responsibilities. Loyalty versus betrayal. All human civilizations have some buy-in to us versus them. So when you are in a group of people, you have a thing that's considered groupthink, right? You as a group begin to function and you share concepts, you share ideas, and you share almost a loyalty or an identity as part of that group. And this foundation is related to human contacts or human beings' contact to tribal organizations from very, very early on. It really underlies any sort of concepts we have about patriotism and buy-in, as well as self-sacrifice on behalf of the group. And this kind of concept, this foundation is kind of activated anytime you have like you're either for us or with us or against us, or one for all and all for one. Anytime you have this like sweeping buy-in or tribalism where you begin to really identify with this group in contrast to that group. Okay, so this is creating intergroup competition, coalition, buy-in, like really leaning into the group of people. It can happen at work, it can happen at school, it can happen with your family, it can happen with politics, it can happen with sports teams, right? You have a buy-in with one particular group. It also pulls in concepts of deference and brotherhood, branding. Like if you have brand loyalty, you're a Verizon person all the way, or you're a T-Mobile person all the way, you like Nike's more than Adidas, right? These are forms of loyalty. And also fandom, I mentioned sports teams. Americans in particular have just a fanaticism over their sports teams. So maybe you're a really big Patriots fan and you will never forgive Tom Brady for leaving, right? That's an example of loyalty versus betrayal. So again, pause the film and take a moment to fill in your box for loyalty and betrayal with buzzwords or examples. I brainstormed fandom with regard to sports, common enemy. It's one of the best ways to form a group, sort of a group coalition, is to find a common enemy. Alliances, and you're either in or you're out concepts. All right, box number 4, authority versus subversion. Every one of us has the propensity or the ability to be a leader, and every one of us has the ability to be a follower. So it's not a value statement, right? It's the concept of how organizations are structured, including civilizations and societies. This is shaped across all mammal tribes, all mammal living conditions. This is because there's always some sort of rank and file. Someone's in charge and someone is not, right? Somebody is subversive and someone is the authoritarian. It depends on how that power is distributed, how that looks. So this has to do with the way human beings organize themselves in relationship to the structure of power. Who is in charge? What are the rules? This has to do with our respect for one another and our respect for authority, the rank, or like where you fall on the hierarchy, seniority, and also concepts of dominance and power. I want to introduce one other concept here, and that's the issue of resistance or revolution, because revolution is really all about the overthrow of traditional, authority. So this is kind of the grassroots, like kind of revising or resisting that which is sort of taken for granted in terms of the organizational structure. So it has to do with power and authority and leadership, as well as the rank and order of individuals. So again, pause the recording and brainstorm for yourself what goes in that box. For me, I put leadership, rules, role and rank, power, and revolution. So that's what I put in the box for authority versus subversion. Now let's get to the very last box, and this is one of the ones that makes humankind and human beings unique. All of these other 4 foundations, we can find examples in the animal kingdom as well as among humans. But with regard to sanctity versus degradation, this is particularly unique to human beings. If you were to look at those top 4, right? Care for the young or elderly versus harm or threats, fairness versus cheating, so the distribution of tasks, roles, and responsibility, loyalty versus betrayal, so group buy-in versus outsiders, and authority or organizational structure versus subversion, just who's in charge. You really can find that in examples of like lions and elephants and whales and dolphins, right? You can find it in a variety of organizations in the animal kingdom. But sanctity versus degradation is unique to humans because it has to do with human beings' understanding of the universe around them and kind of the greater questions that go beyond humankind. So you probably are thinking, well, what's left out? What's different? Well, maybe you're thinking spirituality, religion, and or God. And this foundation was shaped by our psychology, right? In terms of humankind. Humankind seeks out nirvana and utopia. So the psychology behind it is this belief that that which is pure can be contaminated, and typically by human beings. It underlines all religious notions, regardless of what religious faith that you might adhere to. These kinds of concepts of this moral foundation are not unique to your particular religion or spirituality. They are unique instead to human beings, which is kind of incredible. This is because humans strive, right? All humans in all religious structures strive to live in like elevated, noble versions of utopia. And this underlines kind of a widespread idea across human civilizations that something is holy, right? Something out there is holy. Either it's your body, it's a temple, it's wilderness, it's the universe, right? And that it can be desecrated by immoral activities or contaminants. This is not unique to religion, however. This is unique to humans. No matter where you fall on the religious spectrum, it is likely that you think of something as pure and good, and that it could possibly be threatened by a contaminant. This moral foundation regards all concepts of God, universe, higher power, etc. It is what grounds a lot of our thinking when it comes to religious and sacred temples or landmarks, statues, etc. And it is also what oftentimes motivates conversations around avoiding waste or disease or mixing germs, believe it or not. So take a moment, pause the recording, and brainstorm things that fit in the box about sanctity versus degradation. All right, for me, I wrote the following. I did the same thing that I did for care and harm, where I did like a plus and a negative. On the plus side under sanctity, I wrote purity, God, universe, and wilderness, as well as tradition. And under degradation, I wrote contamination, others, and germs. So take a look at your chart. Moral foundations theory. Let's just look at the middle column, right? Do you pretty much agree that every human you've encountered and every civilization that you know of probably falls somewhere on each of these 5 moral foundations along the way? Do you agree that for the most part, all human beings are trying to achieve these moral foundations? And if they're not trying to achieve it, they're at least living governed by it based on the rules of society around them. Okay, if we all agree, if all human beings, and in fact, if all mammals for the most part, agree on these moral foundations, what is the deal with partisanship? If we all agree on the basic structure, or on the basic rules or the basic elements, why is there such a conflict between, in this case, Republicans and Democrats, or those on the left and those on the right? What do you think? Take a moment and look at your chart and think to yourself, why is there such a problem with partisanship if Americans for sure agree on the foundations, the moral foundations, as we've outlined already? It has to do with the way moral foundations theory is then applied. It has to do with kind of how we organize ourselves around not just the foundations themselves, but how to achieve these foundations, how to actually accomplish these ideals, and how to govern ourselves and create these opportunities. So for the rest of the day, or the rest of the lecture, we're going to be identifying examples of how the left might approach any one of these foundational theories, or how the right might approach any of these foundations. So first we have to kind of explore what is left and what is right. So what I'd like you to do is on the left side of your paper, using blue for me, is I want you to just write the word left and underline it. Okay. On the right side, using red, I'd like you to write right. And what we're going to try to do is explore the approaches and the rhetoric for each side when it comes to these moral foundations. Now, in order to kind of understand how the left functions and thinks versus how the right functions and thinks, it's really complicated, but basically it comes down to the assumption of power, how power is structured and organized, and how sort of like we can achieve these moral foundations and who has the authority to institute certain things to make this happen. So I'm going to do a little demonstration for you. I want you to pretend that this Kool-Aid powder that's coming in this little bag is the consolidation of power and authority, okay? And when we start, we're going to start on the right. So I'm not going to use the whole thing, but let's pretend that this little amount of Kool-Aid, this kind of reddish pinkish powder, is the authority and the power. That is the power of our system, okay? You can't really see it, but it's like down there, it's kind of turning a little bit orange. If you're far on the right, really far on the right, you believe in a concept of fascism. So that means basically that power, see if I can get it to stir up a little bit, power and authority is diluted very small. One person is responsible for making sure all of these moral foundation theories are met. So you can see that's like a really thick yellow, almost pasty color, right? There's not a whole lot of distribution of power. That's because fascism is the belief that the best way to function as a society is under a dictator. One person, typically a man, is responsible for maintaining all of those 5 moral foundations and governing how those things are accomplished. The next step, if you dilute that power just a little bit, okay? So it's just a little bit less concentrated. It's still pretty strong, right? That's like Nazism, where you have a political party that is controlling all of the power, the money, the resources, and the approach to achieving these moral foundations. Dilute it even more, and you have what's called a monarchy. Now, a monarchy isn't just a king or a queen. It's a royal family and an alliance of royal families. So it's distributed a little bit more than, say, fascism, which is one person, or Nazi, which is maybe a group of people. Instead, the monarchy is distributed over generations and throughout usually geographical elements, etc. Then you have conservatism. Conservatism is the belief that a larger population of people should have access to wealth and power, but that they shouldn't distribute that wealth and power or govern beyond their own circumstances. So this is where you begin to see this discussion of government being small versus big. So the further right you go, the smaller you want your government to be, shrinks down to one person essentially. And the further left you go, the larger you want your government to be. So you'll notice on this chart that conservatives are a little bit watered down version of what's on the far right, just like liberals are a watered down version of what's on the left. And they're closer to the middle in terms of theory than you would think. Today's world, there's this belief that essentially they're so opposed, they're so oppositional, but actually they can be relatively moderate on either side. So liberalism and conservatism are strangely similar in that they believe that the power should be distributed differently and more equally than, say, like a monarchy or a dictatorship. But conservatives believe in a shrinking government, whereas liberals believe in an expanding government in order to achieve those moral foundations. They believe the government's responsibility is to help address some of these circumstances. Socialism, again, continues to dilute the color, dilute the power a little bit. It might be a little, it's not as like clear as you might like, but socialism kind of dilutes the power even more in the sense that the government is responsible for managing all of the resources and materials, but it's meant to distribute equally among all people. Okay, so socialism, again, is sort of the structuring of resources and power by a government system that then distributes it equally to all of the people involved. Communism is similar. Communism is the pooling of resources, so you have more responsibility and more authority and power shared among people. So the pooling of all resources and then the redistribution of said resources to all of the people involved in the society. So you can start to see that you go from one person to being in charge to a distribution of power across the board. And then the furthest diluted you can go, the most left you can possibly go, is if I were to fill this bowl up with all water and you saw that the power, the yellow, was distributed so much that it was almost clear, that's anarchy, right? That nobody has any authority or control, and that it's all just sort of every person for themselves. So you can see how we might have conflicts when it comes to moral foundations theory based on how you believe we can achieve these moral foundations. Who is responsible for making these things happen? This is a massive chart, and we're actually going to go back to our own chart and kind of make use of this theory when it comes to partisanship. But I just wanted to point out some of the differences between the left and the right. Okay, on the left, you tend to see desires for progressivism, a future look, like an approach looking to the future, wanting to support egalitarian approaches, a very idealistic kind of hopefulness of the future, and an emphasis on equality or equity. On the right, on the other hand, you also see a discussion of equity, but in different terms. Very pragmatic approaches in terms of fiscal and resource distribution. A meritocracy that you work, like the harder you work, the better you'll be kind of thing. Less focus on the future and more focus on the past, and sort of a conservative nature. Look at these little charts on the top left where it says interfere with. On the left, people who are more liberal believe that the government's role and overall society's role is to interfere with society and the social lives of others in order to make things better. On the right, they believe that the government and others should not interfere with society and with social lives, and that will actually make things better, the less interference that there is. So you can see down here, and we're going to pause this and you can take a look at it later, but the approach, right? The approach to a liberal agenda in terms of the moral foundations of society is utopianism. The world can be improved. Let's innovate, let's make it better. And the approach on the right is preservation. Let's protect that which is good and not change it if it ain't broken, okay? So let's talk about each of those moral foundations and how the left versus the right approaches those things. So take your chart, and on one side you have left and on one side you have right, and we're gonna go through and discuss each of the foundations and how the left or the right might approach it. All right, so we know that the left is motivated by utopianism and the right is motivated by preservation. But what are some other forms of legislation, rhetoric, or approach that the left takes versus the right? Let's start with care versus harm, right? Let's remember the care versus harm concept is rooted in the ideas of protection, caring for others, and protecting each other against threats of violence. So on the left, one of the ways that the left approaches protection for elderly, young, and people who are in need is through things like affirmative action, shared authority, and civil rights, right? You think about the left and how they approach those kinds of things. On the right, they have a totally different way of approaching these concepts. The right is more interested in or uses more rhetoric towards protection of the group, right? Let's gate in and gate out. Gate in the good, gate out the bad, right? Establish borders and boundaries. Same moral foundation, totally different approach. Okay, now continue to do this as I talk you through. Let's start with the right this time. Fairness versus cheating. How does the right approach the fairness versus cheating, and how does the left approach it? Well, the right is really grounded in concepts of equality, equal across the board, not equity. Everybody should get the same amount, regardless of need, right? Freedom, individuality, autonomy, the right to govern oneself. That is central, that is crucial to the right's understanding of fairness versus cheating. But what about the Democratic side or the left side? They're much more interested in concepts of equity. Equality is equal distribution of everything. Equity is a balanced distribution based on need. Access, anticipating needs of others. And think about this again. The question comes down to that Kool-Aid bowl I was holding. Who is responsible for making these things happen? The further right you are, the more authoritarian you believe. So one person is responsible for this. And maybe that one person is the king, or maybe that one person is you, right? If you're the further left, you believe in the distribution of this power and authority. So the further left you go, everyone should buy in. Everyone should participate in this. Everyone should pay taxes or contribute to these resources. So that's how you have a difference of opinion in terms of fairness versus cheating. What about loyalty and betrayal? Now, this one I'm going to use a different color because for the most part, both groups have very similar use of vernacular and rhetoric. They just apply it differently. So let's start with the left this time. Fandom. People on the left have obsessive fandom over celebrities and sports, etc., as well as their own parties. Alliances and common enemy. In 2022, the common enemy is still Donald Trump. How about on the right? Fandom, same thing. Alliances, common enemy. In 2022, the common enemy may be Hillary Clinton still, maybe Nancy Pelosi, right? Same exact approach, different forms, right? Different rhetoric, different targets. All right, let's talk about the right's approach to authority versus subversion. Remember, who's in charge versus who's the follower. This is a party of law and order. Obey, respect, but only sort of the chosen symbols of this side. So like the flag, for example, okay? The belief that if you don't like it, you can go away kind of thing. Patriotism. Now on the left, totally different approach to the exact same issue. Less about law and order and more about revolution, distribution of goods or power, new calls in the late 2010s to topple the patriarchy. Same moral foundation, two wildly different approaches. And then finally, let's talk about sanctity, the belief in the higher power or the good or the preservation of good, right? I'm going to use green again for one thing, and that's tradition. Both parties have a deference for tradition. But that's a little bit where it stops. I mean, not really, because both have faith-based institutions, but in terms of the rhetoric they use. The left is motivated by things like environment, purity or beauty, let's say beauty, choice, and the intermixing of cultures for the sake of beauty. Kind of a beauty or a utopia. Remember, the left is motivated by what could be, right? Okay, now the right. The right uses a totally different approach. Also traditional, but a fear of mixing. Remember that preserve what is good, right? So fear of mixing. authority of God, one God, and no no kind of acceptance of other deities, right? This is how we got here. This is how we got to partisanship. The whole society can agree on moral foundations, but different groups have different approaches to meeting the needs of moral foundations theory. So take a look again at this chart, right? All of these different ways that the left tries to appeal to each other and affix a moral foundations theory. All the different ways that the right tries to do the exact same thing in the exact same political structure. So we go back to this question. We may share moral foundations. As humankind, we do. We even share some of these foundations with other animals, right? But we struggle to determine how to achieve these things. I hope that this helped and didn't actually muddy the waters for you any more than it probably was already muddied. But I encourage you to really take some time to look at this chart and do some more exploring to see if you can't find some more rational reasons as to how you kind of would see your own approach to this, how you believe the government or the distribution of power should play a role in these things. And if you maybe can find some common ground with people that you thought that you were politically opposed to in the past. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, historians. I hope you have a great day.